My name is Elias Ramsey. I am 75 years old and I am a retired professor of history. For 42 years, I have carried a secret to protect my son. At his wedding rehearsal dinner, his beautiful, ambitious fiancée raised a glass to me. She smiled and told a room full of their powerful friends a joke, a little story about the tragedy of me raising my son alone. Everyone laughed. In that moment, she thought she was just clearing away a piece of the past she found inconvenient. She didn't know she was handing my son the very key that would unlock a truth so devastating it would bring their entire perfect world to an end. Before I tell you how 4 little words can unravel a lifetime, I would be honored if you would let me know in the comments where you're listening to this from. And please hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that the sacrifices of a parent should be a source of honor, not a punchline. The rehearsal dinner was held at a place in Philadelphia called the Bellevue, a grand old hotel that seemed to be built from another century. The ceilings were impossibly high, decorated with intricate plasterwork and dripping with crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, golden, and very expensive light on everything. I had spent my life in lecture halls and dusty libraries, places of quiet thought. This was a place of loud, declarative wealth, and I felt like a dusty old book that had been accidentally left on a polished marble table. I was wearing my best suit, the dark gray one I had bought for my own retirement party, but in this room, surrounded by men in custom-tailored tuxedos and women in glittering dresses, I felt like a man in work clothes. But the discomfort, the feeling of being an outsider, was a small price to pay for the look on my son's face. Marcus, my son, Dr. Marcus Ramsey, one of the top cardiothoracic surgeons in the country. He was standing near the head of the long, beautifully set table, and he was radiant. He was not just happy, he was luminous, glowing with a joy so profound it seemed to light up the whole room. He stood with his arm around his fiancée, Chloe Bennett, a woman as beautiful and as polished as the room around her. She was a vision in a sleek silver dress, her smile as bright and as hard as the diamonds at her throat. When the time for toasts came, Marcus was the first to stand. He raised his glass, his eyes scanning the room, and when they found mine, he gave me a small, private smile, a gesture that traveled across the room and warmed me from the inside out. "I want to thank you all for being here," he began, his voice a deep, confident baritone, the voice of a man who is used to being in command in the operating room in life. "I am the luckiest man in the world tonight, not just because I am about to marry the most incredible woman I have ever met," he said, smiling at Chloe, who preened under his gaze, "but because I have had the privilege of being raised by the greatest man I have ever known." He turned his full attention to me then, and the entire room followed his gaze. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, and for the first time that night, I did not feel like an outsider. "My father, Elias Ramsey," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. "For those of you who don't know his story, he is a man of quiet strength, a man of profound integrity. He was both a father and a mother to me. He worked a full day as a history professor, and then he would come home and work a second shift as a cook, a tutor, a nurse, a friend. He never complained. He never faltered. He taught me not with lectures, but by his own quiet example what it means to be a good man." He raised his glass higher, his eyes locked on mine. "Everything I am, every success I have ever had, every life I have been privileged enough to save, it is all built on the foundation that this man gave me. He is my hero, my compass, my rock. Dad, I love you more than words can say. Thank you for everything." The room erupted in a wave of warm, genuine applause. I felt a lump form in my throat, a feeling of pride so immense it was a physical pain. I stood up and raised my own glass to him, my son, my beautiful, successful, and good-hearted son. And as I sat back down, my eyes, a little blurry now, drifted to Chloe. She was looking at Marcus, her hand on his arm, her face a perfect portrait of wifely adoration. But her eyes, her sharp, intelligent, and deeply cold eyes, were not on her fiancé. They were on me. And her smile, the one that was meant for her new heroic father-in-law, did not quite reach them. It was a smile of polite public approval, and behind it I saw for just a fraction of a second the cold, hard glint of a closed and locked door. My son's toast, his heartfelt and public declaration of love, was a warmth that spread through me, a welcome fire against the cold, alien grandeur of the room. For a few brief moments, I was not an outsider. I was a father basking in the success and the goodness of the son I had raised. The applause that followed was a genuine warm sound, and as it died down, a sense of peace settled over the dinner. The meal continued, the conversations became lighter, the laughter easier. It was during a lull as the main course was being cleared away and the dessert plates were being set that she made her move. Chloe, my new daughter-in-law, had been the perfect hostess, gliding from table to table, a word here, a dazzling smile there. I watched her, and I could not deny her skill. She was a master of this world, a conductor of a symphony of influence and charm. She caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod towards a set of French doors that led out onto a quiet, dimly lit balcony. It was a summons. I excused myself from my table, my heart giving a small, nervous flutter. I told myself it was nothing. She was just being a good hostess, making sure her old father-in-law was feeling included. I stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool and smelled of the city, a mix of car exhaust and the faint green scent of the nearby park. The noise of the party was a muffled, happy drone behind the thick glass doors. Chloe was already there, leaning against the stone balustrade, a silhouette against the glittering skyline of Philadelphia. She did not turn as I approached. "It's a beautiful view, isn't it?" she said, her voice a low, smooth thing, a voice that matched the expensive silver dress she was wearing. "It is," I said, standing a respectful few feet away from her. "A beautiful party, Chloe. You and Marcus have done a wonderful job." "Thank you, Elias," she said, still not looking at me. "I believe in the importance of details. The right details create the right impression, and the right impression is everything." She finally turned to face me, and her smile in the dim, indirect light of the balcony was not warm. It was the cool, appraising smile of a CEO about to discuss the terms of a contract. Marcus's toast was very emotional. She began the word emotional, sounding like a clinical diagnosis for a minor but treatable illness. "He loves you very much. It's very sweet." "I love him too," I said simply. "I know," she said. "And that's what I wanted to talk to you about, your speech, tomorrow at the wedding." She paused, choosing her words with the precision of a surgeon. "I've been working with the wedding planner to create a certain flow for the reception. A narrative, if you will. We want it to be a celebration of the future, a story of success of two powerful families coming together to build something new and exciting." I had a feeling I knew where this was going. "That sounds lovely, Chloe." "It will be," she said with a confidence that left no room for doubt. "Which is why I think it's important that your speech fits into that narrative. It should be an extension of Marcus's toast. It should be about his achievements, his incredible career, the brilliant future he has ahead of him. It should be celebratory and forward-looking." She took a small, deliberate step closer. "What it should not be," she continued, her voice dropping, becoming a confidential, almost conspiratorial whisper, "is a sad story about the past. I know you and Marcus have been through a lot. I know it was a struggle, and I admire you for it, I truly do. But a wedding reception is not the place for sentimental stories about hardship. It can make the other guests uncomfortable. It brings down the energy of the room." I stared at her, the cool night air suddenly feeling much colder. She was not just giving me advice, she was giving me a script. She was censoring my life. The story of my son and me, a story of struggle and sacrifice and a love so profound it had carried us through the darkest of times, was just an uncomfortable, sentimental story to her. It was a detail that did not fit into her perfect narrative. "I want you to be a star tomorrow, Elias," she said, placing a hand on my arm. Her touch was as cool and as hard as a piece of jewelry. "I want people to see you as the proud father of a brilliant, successful man, not as anything else." The words "anything else" hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. Not as a man who was left behind, not as a man who had to struggle, not as a man whose past was anything less than perfect. "Just keep it short," she said, giving my arm a final patronizing pat. "Keep it positive, and keep it focused on the future. I know you'll do a wonderful job." She gave me one last dazzling smile, a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, and then she turned and glided back into the party, back into the light and the laughter, leaving me alone in the darkness. I stood there on that balcony for a long time, the cool stone of the balustrade pressing into my hands. The beautiful view of the city skyline was just a blur of meaningless lights. My son's toast, which had filled me with such warmth and pride just an hour before, now felt like a tragic irony. He had called me his rock, his foundation, and his new wife, the woman he had just declared the center of his world, had just quietly and politely informed me that the foundation was to be kept hidden out of sight lest its rough, unpolished edges spoil the look of the beautiful house she was building on top of it. The first crack in this perfect picture had appeared, and it was a deep one. My new daughter-in-law's words on the balcony were a quiet, polite assassination of my past. She had, in the space of 2 minutes, reduced the story of my life, the story of my son's upbringing, to a collection of sentimental stories about hardship that were unfit for her curated celebration. I had thought that was the end of it, a simple but brutal set of instructions. I was wrong. It was only the beginning of her attempt to rewrite our history. As she turned to leave, she paused. "Oh, Elias," she said, her voice bright as if she had just remembered a trivial but helpful detail. "I almost forgot." She reached into the small, impossibly expensive-looking clutch she was carrying and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a high-quality cream-colored card, the kind used for formal invitations. She handed it to me. "I was so worried you might be nervous about the speech tomorrow," she said, her voice dripping with a false, condescending sweetness. "Public speaking can be so daunting. So I took the liberty of jotting down a few bullet points. Just some ideas. A little framework to help you organize your thoughts. I think you'll find these points will fit the tone of the evening perfectly." I took the card from her. Her fingers did not touch mine. The card itself felt cool and heavy in my hand. I didn't look at it right away. I just held it as she gave my arm another one of her cool, proprietary pats. "You're a wonderful man, Elias," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of a loving daughter-in-law. "And we are so lucky to have you. I can't wait to hear your speech tomorrow." And with that, she was gone, a silver ghost disappearing back into the warm, golden light of the... I stood there for a long time, the cool night air doing little to quell the slow, hot burn of a new and unfamiliar anger. A framework. Bullet points. She had not just given me instructions, she had given me a script. She was not just the director of this play, she was now the writer as well. I finally unfolded the card. Her handwriting was as perfect and as sharp as the rest of her, a series of precise, elegant, and completely soulless loops and angles. The heading at the top of the card read, "Ideas for Father of the Groom's Toast." I began to read. The first bullet point was, "Start with a humorous, self-deprecating anecdote about being a history professor. Maybe something about being more comfortable with dusty books than with champagne toasts." I stopped, my blood running cold. She was not just telling me what to say, she was telling me who to be. She wanted me to play a character, a harmless, folksy relic for her guests to chuckle at before they moved on to the next course. The second point was even worse: congratulate Marcus on his incredible professional achievements. Mention his recent award from the American College of Surgeons and the success of his new practice. It was a line item from my son's resume, not a memory from his father's heart. She didn't want a story about the boy. She wanted a press release about the doctor. I kept reading, and with every line a new layer of my life, of my son's real life, was being systematically erased. Highlight the coming together of two great families, the Ramseys and the Bennetts, and the bright future they will build together. The Ramseys, a family of two, a quiet retired professor and his son. The Bennetts, a wealthy, powerful family with a lineage she had described to me in excruciating detail. This was not a coming together of equals in her eyes. This was an acquisition. But it was the final bullet point that truly stopped my heart. Conclude with a light-hearted, forward-looking toast to the happy couple's future success, health and happiness. Keep it upbeat and positive. I stared at the words, and I saw not what was there, but what was missing. There was nothing about my late wife Althea, the woman who had given Marcus his brilliant mind and his artistic soul. There was nothing about the years of struggle, the late nights I had spent helping him with his homework, after a full day of teaching my own dreams set aside so that his could flourish. There was nothing about the little boy who was terrified of thunderstorms or the teenager who had gotten his heart broken for the first time. All of the struggle, all of the sacrifice, all of the pain, and all of the real messy and beautiful love that had forged my son into the man he was, it had all been edited out. It did not fit the narrative. She had not just given me a script. She had given me a work of historical fiction. She was sanitizing our past, scrubbing away the grit and the grease and the tears, leaving only a polished, shiny, and completely hollow story that would not make her important guests feel uncomfortable. I slowly, carefully folded the card and slipped it into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. It felt like a block of ice against my chest. This was not a simple act of a controlling bride-to-be. This was a profound and deeply personal act of erasure. She was not just ashamed of my simple working-class past, she was actively trying to delete it from the record, to replace it with a more convenient, more marketable fiction. And she was asking me to be the one to stand up in front of the world and read that fiction aloud. She was asking me to become a willing accomplice in the burial of my own life and of the memory of the woman I had loved. I turned and looked. I saw her standing beside my son, her hand on his arm, laughing at something one of her friends had said. She looked so beautiful, so perfect. And in that moment, I understood. My wife Ruby had been wrong about one thing. She had said that Lena had a hole in her heart. But as I stood there with her perfect rewritten history in my pocket, I realized the truth was far, far worse. There was no hole. There was nothing there at all. The card Chloe had given me with its neat, soulless script felt like a block of ice in my suit pocket. It was a tangible piece of her ambition, a formal request for me to erase the woman I had loved from the story of our family. Althea, my wife, the brilliant, beautiful, and broken woman who was the source of my son's genius and my life's greatest sorrow. As I stood on that cold balcony with the cheerful noise of the party behind me, the present faded away and I was plunged back into the memory of the night I lost her, the night I made the promise that had defined my entire life. It was 32 years ago. Marcus was 10, a bright, happy boy who worshipped his mother. Althea was a concert pianist, or she had been. Her hands, which could coax the most beautiful, heartbreaking melodies from a piano, were also capable of a terrible stillness. She had what the doctors in their kind clinical language called bipolar disorder. To me, it was just the darkness. It was a thief that would come in the night and steal my wife from me, replacing the vibrant, laughing woman I loved with a hollow, silent stranger who could not get out of bed for days, sometimes weeks at a time. We had a good life in the light. She would play, and the house would be filled with a music so beautiful it felt like a physical presence. She would laugh a deep musical sound, and she would look at our son Marcus with an adoration that was fierce and total. He was her sun, her moon, her stars. But the darkness was always there, waiting at the edges of our happiness, a shadow we could never quite outrun. That last winter, the darkness was worse than it had ever been. She had stopped playing the piano. The house was silent, a silence that was 1,000 times worse than any sad song. She barely ate. She barely spoke. She would just sit in her armchair for hours, staring at a wall, her eyes 2 empty windows. I tried to reach her. Doctors tried. Medications were adjusted. But it was like she was a ship that had slipped its moorings and was drifting out into a vast gray and silent sea, and none of us had a rope long enough to pull her back. The night it happened, the house was quieter. I had put Marcus to bed, and he had asked with the innocent, heartbreaking hope of a 10-year-old boy, "Is Mama going to be better tomorrow?" I had lied to him. I had told him I was sure she would be. "She just needs to rest, son," I'd said. It was the first of the great lies. I went downstairs. The house was dark except for a single lamp burning in the living room. She was not in her chair. I felt a cold, sharp, and immediate fear, the kind that makes the hair on your arm stand up. "Althea," I called out. No answer. I walked through the quiet house, a rising tide of panic in my chest. I looked in the kitchen. I looked in her music room, the piano, a dark, silent coffin under a white sheet. And then, with a dread so total it was a physical sickness, I went to the garage. I don't remember opening the door. I don't remember the details of what I saw. My mind, in an act of profound and lasting mercy, has locked that image away in a dark room and thrown away the key. I remember only a feeling, the feeling of the world ending, the feeling of all the music, all the light, all the warmth being extinguished in a single, silent, and terrible moment. The hours that followed were a blur of flashing lights, quiet voices, and the kind, sad eyes of a police officer who told me he was sorry for my loss. They were professional, and they were respectful. But my mind was not there with them. My mind was upstairs in a small room with dinosaur wallpaper where my son was sleeping safe and innocent and completely unaware that his world had just been shattered. And as I stood there, a hollowed-out man in my own home, a single clear thought rose up through the fog of my grief. It was an instinct, a primal fatherly need to protect my child not just from the world, but from the terrible jagged edges of this truth. He was 10 years old. How could I tell him that his beautiful, brilliant mother, the woman who was his sun and his moon, had been in so much pain that she had chosen to leave him forever? How could he ever recover from a wound that deep? A wound that would tell him in the secret language of a child's heart that he was not enough to make her want to stay. I could not do it. I would not do it. And so in the cold gray hours of that terrible morning, I made a vow, a silent promise to my sleeping son. I would take the truth of his mother's death, the ugly, complicated, and painful truth of her illness, and I would bury it. I would carry it for him. I would bear the weight of it alone for the rest of my days. And in its place, I would give him a simpler story, a cleaner wound, a story of a woman who had left, not a woman who had been lost. I would accept the world's judgment of me as a man who had been abandoned. I would carry that quiet shame if it meant my son could be spared the greater, more terrible shame of believing he was the one who had been left behind. I walked into his room. He was curled up under his covers, his face peaceful in the dim light of his little rocket ship nightlight. I knelt by his bed, my heart a raw, open wound, and I made my promise. "I will protect you," I whispered to his sleeping form. "I will always protect you." It was a promise born of a love so fierce it was a form of madness. It was a promise I had kept for 32 years. A promise that Chloe, with her sharp, cruel, and careless words, was now threatening to burn to the ground. The day of the wedding was a beautiful, elaborate lie. I played my part. I walked my daughter down the aisle, my arm linked through hers, my face a carefully constructed mask of fatherly pride. I placed her hand, and as I took my seat in the front row, I felt like a traitor, a silent accomplice to the crime that was about to be committed. The reception that followed was a masterpiece of my daughter-in-law's design. A grand ballroom in a historic Philadelphia hotel dripping with chandeliers and a fortune in white roses. The air was thick with the scent of money and the sound of a string quartet. I found a quiet corner, a glass of water in my hand, and I watched. I watched my son, happy and oblivious. And I watched his new wife, Chloe, a perfect, smiling predator, moving through the room, her every gesture a calculated performance. I was so lost in my own grim observations that I didn't see him approach until he was standing beside me. "It's a hell of a party, isn't it, Eli?" A low, gravelly voice rumbled. It was Leo Fisher, my oldest friend in the world. We had known each other since we were boys, and he had been the one to introduce me to my Althea. He was a jazz pianist, a man who had spent his life in smoky clubs, a man who could read a person like he could read a sheet of music. He was the only person in this room besides me who knew the whole truth of my life. The only one who knew that my wife had not left, but had been lost. "It's something all right," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. To see his familiar, craggy, honest face in this sea of polished strangers was like finding a lighthouse in a storm. "The boy looks happy," Leo said, nodding towards Marcus, who was laughing with a group of friends. "Truly happy." "He is," I said. "He's in love." Leo took a slow sip of his whiskey. "He's in love with the picture," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Let's just pray the frame is strong enough to hold it." His eyes, the sharp, observant eyes of a man who has watched 1,000 different crowds from 1,000 different stages, were not on my son. They were on Chloe. She was across the room, charming a wealthy-looking older couple, her smile a dazzling high-wattage thing. "You know," Leo said, his voice thoughtful, "I've been watching her for the last hour. She's a brilliant performer, best I've seen in years, but she has one tell." "What's that?" I asked. "Her eyes," he said. "They're always moving. She's always scanning the room, assessing, calculating, looking for the next most important person to talk to. She's not in the conversation she's having. She's already auditioning for the next one. He then turned his gaze from her to me. And the way she looks at you, Elias, it's something else. He paused, swirling the ice in his glass. She looks at you, he said, his voice dropping, like you're a piece of old, comfortable furniture that came with the house. The kind she appreciates in a quaint, historic way, but that she is already planning to have reupholstered, or maybe just moved to the basement because it doesn't quite fit her new modern aesthetic. His words were a perfect, brutal articulation of everything I had been feeling. The conversation on the balcony at the rehearsal dinner, the condescending sweetness, the careful corporate language. It all clicked into place. I was an antique, a piece of the past to be managed. I must have had a look on my face because Leo's expression softened with concern. What did she do, Eli? I took a deep breath. It felt like a betrayal to speak of it, but I had to tell someone. She gave me a script, I whispered, my voice hoarse, for my speech, a list of bullet points, told me to keep it short, positive, and to not talk about the past, not to be sentimental. I looked at my old friend, the man who had been there the night Althea died. She wanted me to give a speech about our family's bright future, and she made it very clear that Althea was not to be a part of it. The good humor vanished from Leo's face, replaced by a look of cold, hard anger. He had loved Althea too. He knew her brilliance, and he had known her struggle. That little... He began, his voice a low growl, before catching himself. He just shook his head, a look of profound disgust on his face. Your Althea would have seen right through her in 5 seconds, he said, his voice full of a terrible, sad certainty. She would have taken one look at that perfect plastic smile and she would have known. She would have called her a counterfeit, and she would have been right. We stood there in silence for a long moment, 2 old men in a loud, happy room, sharing a quiet, angry grief for a woman who was being systematically erased from her own son's history. We were the only 2 members of a secret society, the society of those who knew the truth. Leo finally put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. You be careful, Elias, he said, his voice a low warning. A woman who is willing to erase the dead to make her life look better won't hesitate for a second to erase the living. Just then, the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, his cheerful voice booming through the speakers, announcing that it was time for the evening's toasts. The performance was about to reach its peak, and I, the piece of old furniture, was about to be asked to say a few words about the beautiful new decor. The conversation with my old friend Leo was a small, solid island in a sea of glittering, shallow strangers. It was a comfort to know that I was not alone, that at least one other person in this grand, beautiful room could see the cracks in the perfect facade. But the comfort was short-lived. As the dinner plates were being cleared and the waiters began to pour the champagne for the toasts, I saw her moving through the room. Chloe. And she was moving with a purpose. She was moving towards me. She approached our small corner, her smile a dazzling, perfect thing that was meant for public consumption. Leo, she said, her voice a smooth, charming purr as she touched his arm. So wonderful to see you. Would you excuse us for just a moment? I need to steal my father-in-law for a quick pre-speech pep talk. Leo, who could see the cold, hard glint in her eyes that I had missed for so long, just gave her a slow, knowing nod. He's all yours, my dear, he said, his voice a low rumble. He gave my shoulder a quick, firm squeeze as I stood up, a silent message of support, and then he turned his attention to the band. Chloe did not lead me to the balcony this time. She led me to a small, curtained-off alcove near the service entrance, a place of shadows and the faint clattering sounds from the kitchen. The noise of the party was a muffled, distant roar. She dropped my arm as soon as we were out of sight of the guests, and the charming, dazzling smile vanished, replaced by a look of sharp, impatient, and deadly seriousness. The time for pretense was over. Elias, she began, her voice no longer a purr, but a low, sharp hiss. She did not call me Dad. The toasts are about to begin. I just want to be perfectly crystal clear about what is about to happen so there are no misunderstandings. I did not say a word. I just stood there, my hands clasped behind my back, and I listened. I was no longer a father being spoken to by his daughter-in-law. I was a witness listening to a final, damning piece of testimony. Remember what we discussed, she said, her eyes boring into mine. Short, No more than 5 minutes. These people have short attention spans. No one wants to listen to a long, rambling story about the old days. She took a small, sharp breath. Positive. This is a celebration of a bright and successful future. It is not a funeral. We will not be talking about loss or struggle or hardship. We will be talking about achievement, about victory. Her gaze was so intense it was almost a physical force. And most importantly, she said, her voice dropping even lower, becoming a menacing whisper, you will focus on Marcus's achievements. You will talk about his career as a surgeon. You will mention the award he won last year. You will talk about the brilliant man he has become. You will not talk about the sad little boy who lost his mother. You will not tell any of your sentimental working-class stories. No one is interested in how hard it was to get here. They are only interested in the fact that we have arrived. She was standing very close now, her perfume a cloying, suffocating cloud, and then she delivered the final brutal instruction, the one that summed up her entire worldview. Your job is to make my husband look good. Your job is to make me look good. Your job is not to make it awkward for everyone by talking about things that are sad and in the past. I looked into her eyes and I finally completely understood. I saw her not as a woman in love with my son, but as a woman in love with an idea of him, an idea she had carefully constructed. And I, with my real messy and painful past, was a threat to that idea. The memory of my wife Althea, the struggle of raising my son alone, the very foundations of the man he had become, these were not a history to be honored. They were an inconvenience to be managed, an awkwardness to be erased. In that moment, any last lingering flicker of hope I had for her, for my son's marriage, for my family, was extinguished. I saw her for what she was, a brilliant, beautiful, and utterly hollow creature, a woman so terrified of any crack in her perfect facade that she was willing to bulldoze. Do we have an understanding? She asked, her voice the sharp, final question of a boss speaking to a difficult but necessary employee. I held her gaze for a long moment. I let her see the quiet, cold finality in my own eyes. And then I gave a single, slow nod. I understand, I said, my voice a flat, empty thing. Perfectly. A look of triumphant relief washed over her face. She had done it. She had managed the old man. She had controlled the narrative. Her perfect day was safe. Wonderful, she said, her dazzling smile instantly reappearing as she turned to step back into the light of the party. I knew you would. I stood alone in that dark alcove, the sound of her laughter already mingling with the noise of the reception. I could hear the master of ceremonies' voice booming from the speakers, his cheerful words a muffled prelude to the coming drama. In my pocket, I could feel the stiff, sharp edges of the note card she had given me, a useless fictional script. I would be called to the stage in a few minutes. I would be asked to give a toast. And I would. But it would not be her toast. It would not be a celebration of a bright and shiny future. It would be a final, quiet, and terrible history lesson. And it would be the truth. After Chloe left me in that dark alcove, her final chilling instructions hanging in the air, I walked back into the light of the party. But I was a different man. The room, which had seemed so grand and impressive just an hour before, now looked cheap and theatrical. The beautiful, smiling guests looked like actors in a play, their laughter a hollow recorded sound. The warm golden light from the chandeliers now seemed harsh and interrogating. I had been given a script, a role to play the charming, folksy, and ultimately harmless old man, the father of the groom. And in that moment I found a quiet spot near the back of the terrace, partially hidden by a large potted palm tree. It gave me a clear view of the entire scene, allowing me to be what I had always been, an observer. I needed to see him, my son. Marcus was in the center of the room, the undisputed king of his own celebration. He was surrounded by a group of his friends, other doctors, and successful men, and he was holding court. He was telling a story, his hands gesturing, his face alive with a pure, unadulterated joy that was a painful and beautiful thing to witness. He was so completely, so blissfully unaware of the currents of deception and manipulation swirling around him. He did not know that his new wife had just finished giving his father a set of instructions on how to behave. He did not know that his best man was the subject of his father's dark and terrible suspicion. He was just a man in love on the happiest day of his life, standing at the very peak of his own world, with no idea that he was on the edge of a cliff. As I watched him, my heart was a battlefield of warring emotions. The love I felt for him, a vast and ancient thing, was a physical ache in my chest. I saw not just the successful surgeon, but the little boy with the scraped knee, the awkward teenager on his first date, the determined young man in his medical school graduation gown. I saw a lifetime of my own hopes and dreams all manifest in this one good man. And the thought that his happiness, this pure and beautiful thing, was built on a foundation of lies, was a sorrow so profound it almost buckled my knees. I had to protect him. That was the thought that rose up clear and sharp through the fog of my own pain. But how? How do you protect a man from the woman he loves? How do you save him from a dream he doesn't know is a nightmare? My initial fatherly plan to give Lena a chance at redemption now seemed like the height of foolishness. She had made it perfectly clear who she was. She was not a lost girl in need of guidance. She was a cold, hard woman who saw my past and my wife's memory as an inconvenience to be managed and erased. My hand went to the inside pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers found the cool, heavy cardstock of the note card Chloe had given me. I pulled it out, shielding it from view, and I read the bullet points again. Start with a humorous, self-deprecating anecdote. Congratulate Marcus on his professional achievements. Keep it upbeat and positive. It was a script for a stranger, a press release, a work of fiction designed to sell a product. The product was them, the perfect, successful, and completely I looked from the card in my hand with its elegant, empty words to my son across the room, his face so full of an honest, unguarded joy. And I felt a new emotion take hold, an emotion that burned away the sadness and the hurt. It was a cold, clear, and righteous anger. An anger on behalf of my son, an anger on behalf of my late wife, an anger on behalf of the truth itself. This was not just about my wounded pride anymore. This was about a fundamental lie that was being told at the very heart of my family. Chloe was not just marrying my son. She was consuming him, remaking him, editing his life story to fit her own ambitious narrative. And she expected me to be her willing accomplice. She expected me to stand up on that stage and read her fiction aloud to bless the lie with a father's love. I looked down at the card. With a slow, deliberate movement, I folded it in half, and then with a quiet, final tear, the sound was small, but to me it was a declaration of war. I let the two pieces of the card fall back into my pocket. The script was dead. The role she had written for me would not be played. Just then, the master of ceremonies' cheerful voice boomed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. It is now time for our evening's toasts to the happy couple, Lena and Marcus. A wave of applause went through the room. I stood in the shadows, the torn pieces of my daughter-in-law's script in my pocket, and I watched as the final act of this play began. The stage was set. The audience was waiting. And I, the man they thought they had managed, the man they thought they had silenced, was about to be given the microphone. I stood in the shadows, the torn pieces of Chloe's script a small secret pile of rubble in my pocket. From my vantage point, the ballroom was a stage, and the play was in its final triumph. The dinner was over. The champagne had been poured, and the air was thick with the scent of roses and the sound of self-congratulation. My son Marcus and his new wife Chloe sat at the head table on a slightly raised platform, looking for all the world like a king and queen on their thrones, surveying their wealthy, adoring subjects. The master of ceremonies, a man with a voice as smooth and as polished as his patent leather shoes, stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice echoing through the grand hall, "can we have one more round of applause for our absolutely stunning bride and groom, Dr. and Mrs. Marcus Ramsey?" The room erupted in a thunderous, sustained applause. I watched my son. He was beaming, his face open and full of a love so pure and so unguarded it was almost painful to look at. He squeezed his new wife's hand and leaned over to whisper something in her ear, his eyes shining with a happiness I had not seen in him since he was a small boy on Christmas morning. He was so completely, so blissfully unaware of the currents of manipulation and deceit that swirled around him even at his own head table. He was the innocent, the prize, the reason for this entire elaborate performance. And Chloe. She was magnificent, a true artist. She accepted the applause not with the shy gratitude of a new bride, but with the regal calm of a queen who is simply receiving her due. She was radiant, her smile a perfect, dazzling thing, her posture a study in elegant confidence. She had done it. She had achieved the dream. The successful, handsome doctor, the wealthy lifestyle, the perfect high society wedding. She was at the absolute pinnacle of her life's ambition, and her triumph was a cold, beautiful, and terrible thing to behold. As the applause began to die down, I saw her do it. She scanned the room, her eyes, the sharp, intelligent eyes of a master strategist taking in the whole scene, and then her gaze found me standing in the shadows by the potted palm, and she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not the smile of a daughter-in-law to the father who had raised the man she loved. It was a communication, a signal. It was a tight, bright, and deeply menacing smile, a flash of perfect white teeth that held no warmth at all. It was a smile that said without a single word, "I am watching you. Remember our conversation. Remember your lines. Do your part, old man, and do not under any circumstances ruin my perfect day." It was the sweet, terrifying smile of a handler, a final silent warning to a subordinate whose loyalty she did not quite trust. I held her gaze. I did not smile back. I did not nod. I simply looked at her, my own face a calm, unreadable mask. And in that silent 2-second exchange across a crowded room, the war was declared. She saw my stillness not as compliance, but as defiance, and a flicker of something. A tiny spark of cold, sharp annoyance flashed in her eyes before she turned back to her adoring husband. My last lingering shred of fatherly hesitation, the part of me that still recoiled at the thought of causing my son such public pain, was burned away by the cold fire of that smile. She was not just a difficult, ambitious woman. She was a threat to my son's goodness, a threat to the memory of his mother, a threat to the very truth of our lives. And a threat, as I had learned in my long and quiet life, is a thing that must be met, not run from. The MC continued, his voice full of a practiced, cheerful cadence. He introduced the maid of honor, Chloe's sister, who gave a speech full of shallow, funny anecdotes about Chloe's perfectionism and her life. Then came the best man, who told a few generic, slightly off-color jokes about Marcus. The crowd laughed. The champagne flowed. The perfect, happy performance continued, moving inexorably towards its next scene. I stood in my corner, a silent, invisible observer, and I waited. I was not nervous. The time for nerves was long past. I was just calm. It was the strange, preternatural calm of a man who has already made the hardest decision of his life and is now simply a passenger waiting for the inevitable collision. I felt the torn pieces of the note card in my pocket. I thought of my wife, Althea, and I thought of the promise I had made to my sleeping 10-year-old son all those years ago. I will protect you. I will always protect you. I had thought that meant protecting him from a painful truth. I realized now with a terrible, sad clarity that it meant protecting him from a beautiful lie. The best man finished his toast to a round of polite applause. The MC stepped back to the microphone, his smile wider than ever. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice full of a grand, false sentiment. "To say a few words and to offer his own toast to the happy couple, it is my great honor to introduce the proud father of the groom, Mr. Elias Ramsey." A spotlight, hot and white, found me in the darkness. Every head in the room turned to look at me. The moment had arrived. The spotlight found me in the shadows, a single hot white eye that pinned me to my spot. The master of ceremonies had called my name, and a wave of polite, expectant applause rippled through the grand ballroom. Every head in the room turned towards me, a sea of smiling, curious faces. They were waiting for the father of the groom, the proud old man, to walk to the stage and deliver his heartwarming, sentimental toast. They were waiting for the next scene in the perfect play that I felt the torn pieces of her script in my pocket, a secret, silent rebellion. I took a single step forward out of the shadows, my heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. But before I could take a second step, the MC's smooth voice cut through the applause again. "But before we hear from the proud father," he said with a charming laugh, "I think it's only right that we first hear from our absolutely radiant bride, the woman of the hour, Chloe." The spotlight swung away from me and back to the head table, and the applause swelled louder this time, more enthusiastic. A wave of relief so profound it almost made me dizzy washed over me. I had been given a reprieve. A few more minutes of quiet, anonymous observation before my own terrible part in this drama was to be played. I slipped back into the shadows of the potted palm, a ghost once more, and I watched. Chloe rose from her seat with the effortless grace of a trained performer. She was born for moments like this. She glided to the microphone, her silver dress shimmering under the lights, a vision of modern, elegant perfection. She took the microphone from the stand, holding it with a familiar, practiced confidence. The room fell silent, captivated. "Wow!" She began, a small, expertly timed laugh in her voice. "I guess I should have known that even on my wedding day I'd have to fight a man for the microphone." The crowd laughed, a warm, appreciative sound. She had them in the palm of her hand. "But I promise to be brief. I know I am the only thing standing between you and the dessert course." More laughter. She was charming, she was brilliant, and she was utterly, completely false. She started by thanking her own parents, who were seated at a nearby table, beaming with a pride that was almost blinding. She spoke of the values they had instilled in her, a belief in hard work, a drive for excellence, and as she put it with a self-deprecating smile, an unapologetic appreciation for the finer things in life. She told a short, funny, and carefully polished anecdote about her father teaching her how to read the stock market pages before she could read a fairy tale. It was a story designed to do one thing: to establish her own pedigree, to remind everyone in this room of power and wealth that she was not an outsider. She was one of them. Then she turned her attention to my son. She looked at Marcus, and her smile, which had been broad and performative, softened into a look of what to anyone else would have appeared to be deep and profound love. "And then there's this man," she said, her voice a low, intimate purr. "My husband." The word hung in the air, a declaration of ownership. "To say that Marcus is a brilliant man is an understatement," she continued. "He is without a doubt the most driven, the most talented, and the most successful man I have ever known. I have watched him perform miracles in the operating room. I have watched him build a practice that is the envy of his peers. He is an unstoppable force, and I am so incredibly honored to be the woman who gets to stand beside him as we build our empire together." I listened to her words, and a cold, familiar sadness settled in my heart. She was not praising the man. She was praising his resume. She spoke of his talent, his success, his drive. She did not speak of his kindness. She did not speak of his compassion, the gentle heart that made him weep at sad movies, the heart I had been so afraid would be broken. She did not speak of his loyalty, the profound sense of duty that had made him the most wonderful son a father could ever ask for. She spoke of him as if he were— That was what she was building, not a family. I thought of my wife Althea. I thought of the music she used to make, music that was so full of a messy, complicated, and deeply human emotion. Chloe's speech was the opposite of that music. It was technically perfect, brilliant in its execution, and it had no soul at all. She finished by raising her glass. "So I would like to propose a toast," she said, her voice ringing with a triumphant finality. "Not just to a future of love and happiness, but to a future of partnership, of power, of success. To my husband, to our future, to the Bennetts and the Ramseys, to us." The room erupted in a thunderous applause. She was one of them, and she spoke their language, the language of power, of success, of empires. She gave a dazzling final smile, and it was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was a look that said, "This is my world now, this is how it's done." And it was a look that said, "Now it's your turn, and you had better not mess it up." Chloe's speech, with its cold corporate language of empires and assets, was a masterpiece of self-promotion disguised as a toast. The crowd, a room full of people who spoke that same language, had loved it. As the thunderous applause for her died down, she stood by the microphone, basking in the adoration, a dazzling, silver-clad queen who had just secured her kingdom. She gave a final, perfect smile, and for a moment I thought she was finished. I thought my part in this play was about to begin. But she wasn't finished. She held up a single, elegant hand, a gesture that instantly silenced the room again. "Just one more thing," she said, her voice now shifting, losing its sharp corporate edge and taking on a new tone, a tone of soft, performative sympathy. "In all this celebration of the future, we cannot forget the past that made it all possible." Her eyes, which had been sweeping the room, now found me. They locked onto me standing in the shadows at the back of the hall. It was as if a spotlight had been switched on, and I was suddenly unwillingly a part of her performance. And of course, she said, her voice now a low dramatic purr that carried to every corner of the silent room, we have to thank the man who started it all, Marcus's father, Elias. A polite, almost reverent smattering of applause went through the room. I felt my face grow hot. This was not on the script she had given me. This was an improvisation, and I knew with a cold, sinking feeling that her improvisations were dangerous. I looked at my son. Marcus was beaming a look of pure, unadulterated pride on his face. He was so happy that his new wife was publicly honoring his old father. He had no idea that this was not an act of inclusion, but an act of separation. Chloe let the applause die down completely. She held the silence for a long, dramatic moment, ensuring that every single person in that room was hanging on her next word. She was a master of timing, of controlling a room. And in that moment, with every eye on me, she began to set her trap. When I first met Marcus, she said, her voice now full of a soft theatrical wonder. I was of course struck by his brilliance, his drive, his success. But as I got to know him, I saw something deeper. I saw a resilience, a strength of character that you don't find every day. And I asked him, Marcus, where does it come from? And he told me. It came from his father. She turned her body slightly, a gesture that directed the entire room's attention, the entire weight. It came, she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a whisper of feigned profound respect, from being raised by a man who had to do it all on his own, a man who had to be both a father and a mother. She paused again, letting the implications of that statement settle over the crowd, and then she delivered the first sharp and perfectly aimed cut. A man who had to face an unimaginable tragedy. The word hung in the air. Tragedy. The mood in the room shifted instantly. The happy, celebratory atmosphere was punctured, replaced by a somber, morbid curiosity. The guests who had been laughing and drinking just a moment before were now leaning forward, their faces a mixture of pity and a hungry, eager anticipation for a sad story. She had them. She was an artist, and she was painting a new picture for them, a new narrative. And I, a student of history, saw exactly what she was doing. She was not honoring me. She was using me. She was crafting a new origin story for her husband, an origin story that would make his success seem even more heroic, even more remarkable. He was not just a brilliant doctor from a stable, middle-class background. He was a survivor, a man who had risen from the ashes of a tragic past. And she, by extension, was the wonderful, loving woman who had finally brought him the stability and the complete two-parent family ideal he had been denied. And in crafting her perfect, heroic narrative, she was committing a profound and unforgivable act of violence against the truth. My wife Althea, her struggle, her illness, the deep and complicated reality of her life and death was being erased. It was being replaced by a simpler, cruder, and more useful story, a story of a man who had been left behind, a story of abandonment. She was taking the beautiful, painful, and complex music of my wife's life and reducing it to a single, ugly, discordant note. I stood there frozen in the spotlight, my face a mask of stone. I looked at Chloe, at her face so full of a fake theatrical sympathy, and I felt a rage so cold and so pure it was almost a form of peace. She thought she was telling a story about my tragedy, but she was really telling a story about her own character, her own cold, hollow, and opportunistic heart. She had picked up a knife and she was preparing to carve her own perfect story into the heart of my family's greatest pain. And she was doing it with a beautiful, pitying smile on her face. The single word tragedy hung in the air, a piece of bait she had just thrown to a room full of hungry fish. My daughter-in-law Chloe stood at the microphone, a vision of sympathetic silver-clad grace. She had the entire room in the palm of her hand. They were leaning forward, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, waiting for the sad but ultimately heartwarming story of the poor old man who had raised his son all by himself. They were waiting for a story that would make them feel good about their own perfect, unbroken lives. I stood in the spotlight, a fly caught in her web, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the story she was about to tell was not for me or for my son. It was for her. She held the dramatic pause for another heartbeat, and then her expression, which had been so full of a deep, theatrical sorrow, began to change. The corners of her mouth tilted up. The feigned sympathy in her eyes was replaced by a bright conspiratorial gleam. She was an actress, and she was preparing for the punchline. A man who had to raise his brilliant son all alone. She continued, her voice now a light, almost playful thing, as if she were sharing a charming, slightly naughty piece of gossip with a room full of her closest friends. And then she delivered the final venomous blow. After being left by the one who promised to stay, the words themselves were a simple statement of the lie I had lived for 32 years. But it was the way she said them. As she finished the sentence, she gave the crowd a small, almost imperceptible wink. A tiny, flirty, and utterly devastating gesture. It was a wink that reframed everything. It transformed my life's greatest, most sacred tragedy into a piece of light social commentary. It was a wink that said, "We all know the story, don't we, men? They try their best, but they just can't keep a woman. Poor things." A few people in the crowd, her friends. I imagine the ones who understood and appreciated the brutal, sophisticated art of a social takedown let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. The rest of the room followed a second later, not with a roar, but with a scattered, uncomfortable titter. It was the sound of people who were not sure if they were supposed to be laughing, but were taking their cue from the beautiful, smiling woman on the stage. It was the sound of 150 people laughing at the quiet, lonely shame I had carried for over 3 decades to protect my son. The laughter, as quiet and as scattered as it was the sound of a final public desecration. My wife, my beautiful, brilliant, and tormented Althea, her lifelong battle with a darkness that had ultimately consumed her, her final desperate act of a mind at war with itself. It was all gone. In its place was a cheap, simple, and ugly caricature. A woman who had just walked out. And I was the punchline. The poor, hapless man she had left behind. In that moment, I was not just a father being insulted by his daughter-in-law. I was a husband, and I felt a surge of pure cold and protective fury on behalf of the woman I had loved. The woman whose memory Chloe was now so casually and so cruelly dancing on for the mild amusement of a room full of strangers. I looked at my son. Marcus was smiling, but his smile was a confused, uncomfortable grimace. He knew on a deep instinctual level that what his new wife had just done was wrong. He knew that the story of his mother's departure, a story that had been the central painful mystery of his life, was not a subject for a light-hearted joke. He was looking at Chloe with a look of pained confusion, a look that said, "Why would you do that?" But he was a man in love on his wedding day, and he did not have the words or the courage to stand up and say that the joke was not funny. And I, his father, understood. I had spent his entire life teaching him to be a good, kind, and decent man. I had not taught him how to fight a shark that was smiling at him from his own dinner table. Chloe, her work done, her point made, raised her glass. "So let's hear it for the man who did it all," she said, her voice full of a bright, false cheer. "To Elias." The crowd, following their cue, applauded politely. I stood there in the spotlight, the sound washing over me, a meaningless wave of noise. I was the object of their pity, the subject of their amusement, the final folksy anecdote in Chloe's perfect story of her own triumph. The father of the groom, the human trash, the man who had been left behind. I looked at Chloe, who was now smiling at me, a dazzling, triumphant, and utterly merciless smile. And in that moment, the last of the father in me, the part that had been willing to endure any indignity for the sake of my son's happiness, simply died. The war was over. I had lost. But the judgment was yet to come. My face was a mask of pure, cold, and unreadable calm. I was no longer a guest. I was no longer a father. I was a man with a verdict to deliver. And the whole room, whether they knew it or not, was about to hear it. The words she had just spoken, an unimaginable tragedy hung in the air, a piece of raw meat she had just tossed to the well-dressed wolves in the room. I stood in the back, pinned by the spotlight, my heart a cold, heavy stone. Chloe stood on the stage, a vision of sympathetic grace, the perfect, loving daughter-in-law. She had the room in the palm of her hand. She had captured their attention with a hint of sorrow, and now I knew she was about to make them laugh. It was a classic performer's trick: draw them in with pathos, then release the tension with a punchline. I was the pathos. My life was the setup, and my wife's memory was about to be the joke. I saw the shift in her expression. The deep theatrical sorrow in her eyes began to change. The corners of her mouth, which had been turned down in a mask of pity, began to tilt upwards. A bright conspiratorial gleam replaced the feigned sympathy. She was a master of her craft, and she was preparing to deliver the final killing blow. A man who had to raise his brilliant son all alone, she continued, her voice changing, becoming a light, almost playful thing, as if she were sharing a charming, slightly risque piece of gossip with a room full of her closest confidants. And then she delivered the line that would sever the last fragile thread of our family. After being left by the one who promised to stay. The words themselves were the lie I had lived for 32 years, but it was the delivery that was the true act of violence. As she finished the sentence, she gave the crowd a small, almost imperceptible wink, a tiny, flirty, and utterly devastating gesture. It was a wink that reframed everything. It transformed my life's greatest, most sacred tragedy into a piece of light social commentary. It was a wink that said, "We all know the story, don't we, men? They try their best, but they just can't keep a woman satisfied. Poor, hapless things." A sharp, ugly bark of laughter erupted from a table near the front. It was her friends, the women who looked and acted just like her, the ones who understood and appreciated the brutal, sophisticated art of a social takedown. Their laughter was the signal, the permission slip for the rest of the room. A second later, a wave of scattered, uncomfortable titters spread through the crowd. It was not the sound of genuine amusement. It was the sound of people who were not sure if they were supposed to be laughing, but were taking their cue from the beautiful, smiling woman on the stage. It was the sound of 150 wealthy, powerful people politely, socially laughing at the quiet, lonely shame I had carried for over 3 decades to protect my son. The laughter, as quiet and as scattered as it was the sound of a final public desecration. My wife, my beautiful, brilliant, and tormented Althea, her lifelong battle with a darkness that had ultimately consumed her, her final desperate act of a mind at war with itself, it was all gone. In its place was a cheap, simple, and ugly caricature, a woman who had just walked out, a flighty, unreliable creature. And I was the punchline, the poor, bumbling man she had left behind. In that moment, I was not just a father being insulted by his daughter-in-law. I was a husband, and I felt a surge of pure, cold, and protective fury on behalf of the woman I had loved. The woman whose memory Chloe was now so casually and so cruelly dancing on for the mild amusement of a room full of strangers. I looked at my son. Marcus was smiling, but it was a grotesque, frozen thing, a rictus of confusion and pain. He knew on a deep, instinctual level that what his new wife had just done was profoundly wrong. He knew that the story of his mother's departure, a story that had been the central painful mystery of his life, was not a subject for a light-hearted winking joke. He was looking at Chloe with a look of pained, bewildered horror, a look that said, "Why? Why would you do that?" But he was a man in love on his wedding day, and he did not have the words or the courage to stand up and say that the joke was not funny. He just sat there, his smile frozen, a man paralyzed by a betrayal he did not even fully understand. And I, his father, understood. I had spent his entire life teaching him to be a good, kind, and decent man. I had not taught him how to fight a shark that was smiling at him from his own dinner table. Chloe, her work done her point, made her inconvenient father-in-law put firmly in his place, raised her glass. "So let's hear it for the man who did it all, the ultimate single dad," she said, her voice full of a bright, false cheer. To Elias. The crowd, following their cue, applauded politely. I stood there in the spotlight, the sound washing over me, a meaningless wave of noise. I was the object of their pity, the subject of their amusement, the final folksy anecdote in Chloe's perfect story of her own triumph. The father of the groom, the man who had been left behind. I looked at Chloe, who was now smiling at me, a dazzling, triumphant, and utterly merciless smile. And in that moment, the last of the father in me, the part that had been willing to endure any indignity for the sake of my son's happiness, simply turned to dust. The war was over. I had lost. But the judgment was yet to come. My face was a mask of pure cold and unreadable calm. I was no longer a guest. I was no longer a father. I was a man with a verdict to deliver, and the whole room, whether they knew it or not, was about to hear it. The laughter in the room, that ugly, scattered, and deeply uncomfortable sound, finally died out, leaving a thick, heavy silence in its wake. The spotlight was still on me, a hot, interrogating eye, and I stood there in the back of the room, the center of 150 pairs of staring, pitying eyes. I was the joke. The punchline, the sad, sentimental story that had just been told at my expense. On the stage, Chloe was still smiling, a bright, triumphant, and utterly merciless smile. She had done it. She had successfully and publicly put me in my place, reducing my entire life, my entire history into a quaint, pathetic anecdote for her powerful friends. She had taken my deepest, most sacred wound, the loss of my wife, the lie I had carried for my son, and she had used it as a social prop. She was waiting for me to play my part, to give a sad, humble little nod, to accept my role as the tragic, lovable old man. She was waiting for me to sit back down, and in that moment, I had a choice. I could do what she expected. I could swallow the humiliation, swallow my own rage, and sit down. I could endure the rest of the evening for the sake of my son, for the sake of keeping the peace. It was the path of least resistance. It was the path of a man who has learned to accept his own irrelevance. But as I stood there, pinned by the light, I thought of my wife Althea. I thought of her fierce, brilliant, and uncompromising spirit. She had fought a terrible battle her entire life, a battle against a darkness inside her that I could not even comprehend. She had fought with a courage and a dignity that was nothing short of heroic. And I, her husband, had just stood by and allowed this shallow, ambitious woman to reduce her tragic, noble war to a cheap, tawdry joke about a woman who had simply left. I had allowed her memory to be desecrated, and I thought of David. The good, honest man on the stage, his face a mask of love, completely unaware of the poison sitting right beside him. I had a duty to him, a duty to the truth. The father in me, the man who had spent a lifetime making himself smaller for the sake of his child's happiness, finally and irrevocably died. To sit back down now would not be an act of love for my son. It would be an act of profound self-betrayal. It would be an admission that I agreed with her verdict, that I was in fact human trash. And I was not. I was Elias Ramsey. I was a professor of history. I was a good and loving husband to a wife I still mourned. And I was the father of the man she was trying to steal. I would not sit down. I would not be a prop in her play. I would simply leave the stage. My movements were not angry. They were not rushed. They were slow, deliberate, and full of a quiet, unshakable finality. I calmly, and with a hand that was now perfectly steady, placed my napkin on the empty table beside me. I did not look at the other guests. I did not look at my friend Leo, though I could feel his worried eyes on me. I looked only at the head table. I looked at my son, his face a mask of pained confusion, and then I looked at his new wife, the architect of this humiliation. And I held her gaze. Her triumphant smile faltered. A flicker of confusion, of alarm, entered her cold, confident eyes. This was not in her script. I was supposed to sit down. With my back straight and my head held high, I turned, and I began to walk. I did not walk towards the stage to confront her. I did not walk towards my son to plead my case. I walked towards the grand arched exit at the back of the ballroom. It was a long walk, a walk through a valley of 150 silent, staring strangers. The quiet shuffle of my old shoes on the plush carpet was the only sound in the vast, silent room. Every eye was on me. The air was thick with their unspoken questions. What is he doing? Where is he going? I could feel my son's panic from across the room. I heard him say my name, a low, questioning, "Dad." I heard the scrape of his chair as he began to stand. But I did not stop. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes fixed on the doors. I was not a victim slinking away in shame. I was a man of honor, and I was walking out of a place where honor had just been murdered. My quiet, dignified departure was my only response, my silent rebuttal to her loud, ugly cruelty. It was a statement. I will not participate in this lie. I will not be a character in your fiction. I am leaving your stage. I reached the doors. I did not look back. I did not want to see my son's face torn between his father and his wife. I did not want to see Chloe's face, her perfect evening now marred by this unscripted, uncontrollable act of defiance. I simply pushed the heavy, ornate door open, and I stepped out from the warm, golden, and false light of the party into the cool, dark, and honest air of the night. I had not said a word, but I had given my answer, and the real performance, I knew, was only just beginning. I had taken maybe 3 steps, 3 slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy steps towards the exit. The polite, awkward applause for Chloe's toast had died out, completely replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Every eye was on me, the old man in the simple suit, the piece of human trash who was now committing the ultimate social sin. He was walking out. The act of my departure, as quiet and as dignified as I tried to make it, was a louder and more damning protest than any shout could have ever been. I did not look at the guests. I did not look at my friend Leo, whose face I knew would be a mask of grim approval. I kept my gaze fixed on the ornate double doors at the far end of the ballroom, the gateway back to the real world, back to a world where a man's worth was not determined by the cruelty of his daughter-in-law. But then I heard his voice. "Dad." It was my son, Marcus. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, confused, and deeply pained question. It cut through the silence and stopped me in my tracks. Against my own better judgment, I turned my head, and I looked at him. Our eyes met across that vast, glittering room, and in that single, eternal moment, the performance was over. My mask of cold, impassive dignity must have crumbled. His mask of the happy, oblivious groom had already been shattered. For the first time that day, we were just a father and a son looking at each other across a chasm of pain, and he saw it. For the first time in his life, I think he truly saw me. He saw not the rock, not the pillar, not the quiet, dependable old man who was always there to fix things. He saw the truth. He saw a man who was broken, a man who had been gutted in front of the entire world by the woman standing right next to him. He saw the profound, raw, and unfiltered agony in my eyes. And then I watched as he looked from my face to his new wife's. Chloe was still on the stage, the microphone held loosely in her hand. Her perfect smiling mask had also slipped. She was looking at me not with any sense of remorse or pity. Her face was a storm cloud of pure, unadulterated fury. She was angry, angry that I was ruining her perfect moment, angry that her prop had suddenly decided to walk off the stage. In the face of my profound, soul-deep pain, her only emotion was annoyance. And I saw the moment it all clicked into place for my son. The moment the son became a man. The contrast between my face and her face was a truth he could no longer ignore. The confusion in his eyes, the pained uncertainty, it all vanished, burned away by a sudden hot flash of a new and terrible clarity. The world for him had just resolved itself into a simple, brutal equation. His father's pain on one side, his wife's anger on the other. And he had to choose. He did not hesitate. He pushed his chair back from the head table, the sound of its legs scraping against the marble floor, a violent tearing sound in the dead quiet room. He stood up. And in that moment, every eye in the room which had been fixed on me snapped to him. The groom was on his feet. The king of the celebration was finally moving, but he did not move towards me. He did not come to coax his old father back to his seat, to smooth things over, to keep the peace. His jaw was set, his face a mask of a cold, hard resolve I had never seen in him before. He turned, and with a long, quick, and purposeful stride, he walked towards the stage. He walked towards his wife. The room held its breath. What was happening? Was he going to defend her? Was he going to admonish me over the microphone? Chloe herself seemed unsure. She watched him approach, her look of fury softening into a confused, uncertain alarm. He walked up the small set of stairs and onto the stage. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at me. He looked only at her. He walked right up to her, his new bride, the woman he had just an hour before promised his life to. And he did not grab the microphone from her. He did not snatch it. He simply, with a gentleness that was more chilling than any act of violence, reached out and took it from her hand. Her fingers went limp, and she let him have it without a fight, her face a mask of pure, stunned disbelief. He stood there for a moment, the microphone in his hand, his back to the crowd. He looked at his wife, the woman who had just publicly desecrated his father, and in his eyes was a look of such profound and utter disappointment that it was a verdict in and of itself. He had made his choice. He then turned to face the room. He turned to face the 150 silent, staring guests. He turned to face me, still standing by the door. He was no longer the happy groom. He was no longer the confused son. He was a man who had just seen the truth, and he was about to become its messenger. He raised the microphone to his lips. The quiet click as his thumb found the switch was the sound of a trigger being cocked. The room was a vacuum, a place where sound had ceased to exist. Every eye was locked on the stage, on the man who was supposed to be the happy groom, who now stood with a microphone in his hand and a look of utter devastation on his face. He had taken the microphone from his new wife Chloe with a gentleness that was more terrifying than any rage. She stood a few feet away from him, her own face a mask of stunned, uncomprehending disbelief. The script, her perfect, flawless script, was in tatters, and she had no idea what scene was coming next. My son, my Marcus, did not look at the crowd. He did not look at me. He looked only at her, and in his eyes there was a universe of sorrow and a dawning, terrible clarity. The blind, adoring love that had been there just minutes before was gone, replaced by the cold, hard light of a truth he was only just beginning to comprehend. "Chloe," he said, and his voice, amplified by the microphone, was a low, steady, and unfamiliar thing. It was the voice of a surgeon, precise and clinical, but underneath it there was a tremor of a man whose own heart was breaking on the operating table. "I think you owe my father an apology." She just stared at him, speechless. He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned away from her, a gesture of quiet final dismissal, and he faced the room. He faced the 150 silent, staring guests. He faced the wreckage of his own perfect day. His eyes scanned the crowd, and they found me standing by the exit, a ghost who had been stopped in his tracks. And he spoke to me. "Dad," he said, his voice a little stronger now, "please, don't go." I stood rooted to the spot, caught in the beam of his attention and the force of his will. He then turned his gaze back to the room, to his guests, his friends, his colleagues. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the breath of a man about to dive into a deep and freezing water. "My wife," he began, and the way he said the word wife was a chilling thing, stripped of all its warmth, now just a simple legal designation. "My wife just told you all a story, a little joke. She spoke of my father's tragedy, the tragedy of being left." He paused, and his eyes for a fraction of a second closed, as if the pain of the memory was a physical thing. "For my entire life," he continued, his voice dropping, becoming a raw, vulnerable whisper that the microphone amplified into a roar of emotion, "that has been the central fact of my existence. I am the boy whose mother left. I have carried that story with me every single day. I have carried the questions, the shame, the quiet, unanswered ache of it. I have carried it, and my father has carried it for me." He looked at Chloe, then a quick, sharp, and utterly devastating glance. "And tonight my wife took that story, my father's story, and she turned it into a punchline. She winked. She made you laugh." The room was so quiet that I could hear the hum of the chandeliers. No one was laughing now. They were witnesses to something raw, real, and terrible. They were watching a man unravel, or perhaps for the first time become whole. "But here's the thing," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, harder, fueled by a new and terrible certainty. "When she told that joke, and when you laughed, I looked at my father. I looked at his face. And for the first time in my 42 years, I didn't see the sadness of a man who had been abandoned. I saw the agony of a man who was being forced to protect a lie." He took a step forward to the very edge of the stage, as if to close the distance between us. His eyes were locked on mine, and they were filled with a desperate pleading and horrifying understanding. He was connecting the dots. He was a brilliant diagnostician, and he was in that moment diagnosing the foundational sickness of his own life. He raised the microphone to his lips one last time. He was no longer speaking to the room. He was no longer speaking to Chloe. He was speaking only to me. And his voice, when it came, was a broken, whispered question. A question he already knew the answer to, a question that was a verdict in and of itself. "She didn't leave, did she, Dad?" He asked, the words a raw, ragged plea that tore through the silence of the room. "That's not the truth, is it? The real tragedy is that she never left at all. She died, didn't she? All this time. You've been protecting me from the truth that she died." His question hung in the air, a terrible, beautiful, and devastating revelation. He had found the truth, not because I had told him, but because he had seen it finally in the geography of his own father's pain. My 32-year-old lie, the promise I had made to a sleeping 10-year-old boy, was over. And in its place was a truth far more painful and far more powerful than any lie could ever be. My son stood on that stage, a man standing in the wreckage of his own life, and he spoke the truth he had just discovered in the geography of my own pained face. She died. Didn't she? The question, a raw and broken whisper, echoed through the vast, silent ballroom, not as a question, but as a verdict. He had found it. The secret I had carried for him, the great and terrible weight I had shouldered for 32 years, had finally been brought into the light. I was still standing in the aisle, a ghost who had been stopped in his tracks, and I could feel 150 pairs of eyes turn from him to me, seeking confirmation. I could not speak. The lump in my throat was a stone, the words trapped behind a lifetime of silence. All I could do was look at my son, my beautiful, broken, and finally fully seeing son, and I nodded. A single, slow, and infinitely heavy nod. And as I did, the tears I had not allowed myself to shed since the night she died, finally and irrevocably broke free. They streamed down my face, hot and silent, a confession more powerful than any word could ever be. A sound went through the room, a low collective gasp of a truth finally understood. And on the stage, my son, my Marcus, closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his own cheek. He did not weep for the mother who had left him. He wept for the mother who had been taken from him and for the father who had stood a lonely, silent guard over her memory for his entire life. It was Chloe who broke the spell. The silence, the raw, sacred grief of the moment was an intolerable breach of her perfect evening. She saw control slipping away, and she made one last desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative. "Marcus, for God's sake," she hissed, her voice a sharp, ugly thing that the microphone picked up with perfect clarity. "Stop this. You are making a fool of yourself. You are upsetting everyone. Whatever private issues you and your father have, this is not the time or the place." She was trying to frame it as a breach of etiquette, a private matter being inappropriately aired in public. She was trying to make him and me the villains of her story once again. But my son did not even look at her. It was as if she were a buzzing insect, an annoying, irrelevant noise. He opened his eyes, and he looked at me, a new and terrible strength in his gaze. He had crossed a river, and he was on the other side now. "She is right about one thing," he said into the microphone, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated with a cold, clear anger. "This is not the place. This was supposed to be a place of celebration, of family, of honesty." He turned his head and looked at her, then a look of such profound and utter contempt that she physically flinched. "And you, Chloe?" he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a whisper that was a roar in the silent room, "have made it a mockery of all three." He turned back to the crowd, back to me. "My father is not a victim to be pitied," he declared, his voice ringing with a new fierce and protective pride. "He is a hero. He is a man who, in the face of a grief that would have crushed a lesser man, made a choice. He chose to protect his 10-year-old son from a truth he thought would be too much to bear. He chose to carry the weight of my mother's illness and her death all by himself. He chose to let the world think he had been abandoned, to carry that quiet shame so that I could grow up with a simple, clean memory of a mother who loved me. He was not just telling the story now. He was bearing witness. He was my advocate, my defender, my champion. "The joke my wife told you tonight," he said, his voice dripping with a venom I had never heard from him. "The punchline you all laughed at, that was his sacrifice. That was his gift to me, a gift he has given me every single day for 32 years. And she unwrapped it in front of all of you and called it trash." The mood in the room had completed its transformation. The morbid curiosity, the uncomfortable pity, it had all been burned away, replaced by a wave of profound, silent respect for me, and a wave of equally profound and equally silent disgust for her. She stood on that stage, isolated in a circle of her own, making the villain in a story she could no longer control. Marcus's chest was heaving, the emotional cost of this public confession finally hitting him. But he was not finished. There was one last piece of the truth to be laid bare. "I have spent my entire adult life," he said, his voice a raw, ragged thing, "trying to be a man worthy of my father's sacrifice. I chased success. I chased perfection. I told myself that if I could just build a perfect enough life, I could somehow make up for the imperfection of my own past. I was wrong." He looked at Chloe, and in his eyes was not just anger but a deep and terrible self-recrimination. "I was so focused on building a perfect future that I failed to see the truth of the present. I allowed myself to believe that a perfect life was about a perfect house, a perfect career, a perfect flawless wife." He let the word flawless hang in the air, an indictment of her entire worldview. "I was a fool. A blind, arrogant fool, and I am so sorry, Dad. I am so sorry I didn't see." He was not just apologizing for her cruelty. He was apologizing for his own blindness. He was apologizing for the years he had spent chasing a shallow dream while I had been silently carrying a heavy truth. The room was a sea of stunned, silent faces. The king of the celebration had just publicly abdicated his throne, had declared his entire kingdom a fraud. He was no longer the brilliant, successful surgeon. He was just a son standing on a stage, his heart laid bare for the world to see, trying to find his way back to his father. He looked at me one last time, his face a mask of love and grief and a horrifying dawning understanding. "She didn't leave you," he said, his voice full of a terrible newfound certainty. "She would never have left us. The sickness, the darkness you never wanted me to know about, it took her." He looked at me, his face a mask of love and grief and a horrifying dawning understanding. "She died, didn't she? She died, and you carried it all. Alone." His final question, a statement of fact, disguised as a question, hung in the air, a terrible, beautiful, and devastating revelation. He had found the truth. Not because I had told him, but because he had seen it finally in the geography of his own father's pain. My 32-year-old lie, the promise I had made to a sleeping 10-year-old boy, was over. And in its place was a truth far more painful and far more powerful than any lie could ever be. I couldn't speak. I could only nod, the tears I had held back for a lifetime now streaming down my face, a silent final confession. And in that moment, across a crowded, silent ballroom, my son and I, for the first time in our lives, were finally telling each other the same heartbreaking story. My son stood on the stage, the microphone held out to me and offering a plea, the question he had just asked. She died. Didn't she? Was still hanging in the air, a terrible, beautiful, and devastating truth that had shattered the silence of the room and the silence of our lives. I was still standing in the aisle, frozen with tears streaming down my face, a 75-year-old man who had just been unburdened of a secret he had carried for more than 3 decades. Slowly, as if in a dream, I began to walk. It was the longest walk of my life, a journey of a few yards that felt like a journey across a lifetime. With every step, I could feel the weight of the past, the ghost of my wife Althea walking beside me. I walked past the tables of stunned, silent strangers, their faces a blur of pity and shock. I walked past my friend Leo, who looked at me with eyes full of a deep and sorrowful understanding. I walked towards the stage, towards my son who was waiting for me, his own face a mask of grief and a new, terrible, and profound love. He did not rush to me. He stood his ground, holding the microphone, giving me the dignity of making this journey on my own. When I reached the small set of stairs, he simply held out his free hand and helped me up the final step. He put the microphone into my hand. It was a heavy, cold, and unfamiliar thing. I had spent my life with books and chalk dust, not with stages and audiences. He put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and steady, a son now supporting his father. "Tell them, Dad," he whispered, his voice for my ears only. "Tell them who she was." I turned to face the room. It was a sea of 150 silent, staring faces. They were no longer a crowd of wealthy strangers. They were my witnesses, and I owed them the truth. I owed it to David in the previous story, to the memory of my wife, and most of all, I owed it to the boy who had just become a man in front of my very eyes. "My son is right," I began, and my voice when it came was a raw, rusty thing, a voice unused to speaking its deepest truths. The story he has lived with the story I gave him was a lie. A necessary lie, I told myself. A protective lie, but a lie nonetheless. I took a deep breath, the air in the grand ballroom feeling thin and hard to draw. "My wife," I said, and the word itself felt sacred on my tongue, a name I had not spoken with such weight in 32 years. My Althea, she did not leave us. I looked at my son, and my voice broke. She would never have left us. I had to stop to gather myself. The story was a wild, wounded thing, and I had to be careful not to let it consume me. To understand what happened, I said, my voice a little stronger now. You cannot think of her as the woman who left. You must think of her as she was. She was not just a wife and a mother. She was music. She was a concert pianist, I told them. I met her in this very city at a little jazz club downtown. I was a young, awkward history student, and she was a force of nature. When she sat at a piano, she wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was telling a story. Her music was full of a fire and a passion and a joy that I had never known. It was the sound of life itself, and I, a man who had only ever known the quiet dust of the past, fell in love with the sound of her. Our first years together were a symphony. Our home was never quiet. It was filled with the sound of her practicing, the sound of her composing, the sound of her deep musical laughter. And when our son Marcus was born, that music became a lullaby. She would hold him for hours, playing soft, gentle melodies, her love for him a tangible thing, a chord that resonated in every corner of our small home. She was not a distant, flighty artist. She was a mother fierce and total in her devotion. He was her greatest composition. I looked out at the silent, captivated faces, and I tried to make them see her, the woman I had loved, not the caricature Chloe had so cruelly painted. "But my Althea," I said, my voice dropping. She had a shadow, a darkness that lived inside her alongside all that beautiful light. The doctors had a name for it. They called it bipolar disorder. But to us it was just the quiet. It was a thief that would come and steal her music away. There were times, I explained the memories, a series of painful, vivid images in my mind, when the music would just stop. For days, sometimes for weeks, she would be gone from us, even when she was sitting in the same room. She would sit at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, but she could not play. The light in her eyes would go out, and she would be a stranger lost in a vast gray and silent landscape where none of us could reach her. We tried. Doctors tried. I tried. I would hold her. I would talk to her. I would play her the recordings of her own beautiful music, trying to remind her of the woman she was. Sometimes it would work. The light would flicker back on. The music would return. And we would have another season of sunshine. I was no longer just telling a story. I was bearing witness to her struggle, to her courage. She fought, you understand. Oh, how she fought. She fought with a bravery that I, a man who has only ever known the quiet battles of the mind, could never comprehend. She fought for her music. She fought for her life. But most of all, she fought for him. I looked at my son who was standing beside me, his face a mask of love, and a new, terrible understanding, the tears streaming down his face, unashamed. She fought for her boy. She loved you so much, Marcus. More than the music. More than life itself. The silence in the room was a sacred thing now, a shared space of grief and respect. The cheap joke, the scattered laughter, it was a distant, shameful memory from another lifetime. I was not just talking about a wife. I was talking about a hero, a beautiful, brilliant, and broken hero who had fought a war against her own mind. And then I had to tell them the end of the story, the final, terrible chapter. That last winter, I said, my voice a raw, ragged whisper. The quiet was longer than ever before. The darkness was deeper. The music was gone, and this time I knew with a certainty that was a cold physical sickness in my gut, that it was not coming back. I described the silence of the house, the emptiness in her eyes, the way she would look at Marcus with a love so profound and so full of a terrible, heartbreaking sorrow. I described the night it happened, the night my world ended. I did not give them the graphic details. I did not need to. They could hear the truth in the broken pieces of my voice. I spoke of the final, terrible silence of the garage. I spoke of the flashing lights. I spoke of the kind, sad eyes of a police officer. And then I spoke of the promise. As the sun came up that morning, I said, my voice barely audible, I was a hollow man. My music was gone forever, but my son was still there. He was 10 years old, and he was sleeping in his bed, a little boy who worshipped his mother. And I had a choice, a terrible choice. I could tell him the truth. I could tell him that his beautiful, brilliant mother, the woman who was the sun and the moon to him, had been in a pain so deep, so absolute, that she had chosen to leave him forever. I could give him a wound that would tell him in the secret language of a child's heart that he was not enough to make her want to stay. I looked at my son, my 42-year-old son, who was now weeping openly, a man finally grieving for the little boy who had never been allowed to. Or, I whispered, I could take the wound for him. I could build a wall around his heart, a wall made of a simple, clean, and terrible lie, a lie that would protect the beautiful memory of his mother, a lie that would place the shame, the quiet judgment of the world on my shoulders, not on his, a lie that said she left me, not that she left him. I was no longer speaking to the room. I was speaking only to my son. I chose the lie. I said, my voice a raw confession. It was a promise I made to a sleeping 10-year-old boy. I would carry the truth so that he would not have to. And I have carried it every single day for 32 years. It was a father's choice, A terrible, loving, and perhaps a foolish choice. It was the only choice I knew how to make. I finished. The story was told. The silence in the room was no longer one of shock or pity. It was a silence of profound and deeply human understanding. The joke was dead. The laughter was a ghost. All that was left was the truth, a truth as beautiful and as tragic as the music my Althea used to make. I stood there on the stage, a tired old man, my confession laid bare for the world to see. Chloe was a statue of pure, horrified disbelief, the architect of a perfect evening who had just watched her entire creation. And my son, my Marcus, he did not speak. He simply stepped forward, and in front of that 150 silent witnesses, he wrapped his arms around his old, broken father. And he held me. He held me as I had held him all those years ago, a father and a son, finally after a lifetime standing together in the wreckage and in the truth. The embrace between my son and me there on that brightly lit stage was a silent and profound thing. It was a lifetime of unspoken truths, of shared grief, and of a new, terrible, and beautiful understanding, all condensed into a single, desperate moment. For 32 years, I had been his protector. Now, in a way, I could never have imagined he was mine. When he finally, reluctantly let me go, the silence in the grand ballroom was no longer one of shock. It had transformed. It was now a heavy, reverent silence, the kind you find in a church or a library, a silence full of a shared and deep. And then as one, the entire room's attention, the entire weight of their collective judgment pivoted. It moved from my son and me, and it settled like a physical weight onto the third person on that stage. It settled on Chloe. She was standing a few feet away, a statue of silver and shattered pride. The spotlight, which had once been her adoring servant, was now a harsh, interrogating glare. The 150 faces that had just minutes before looked at her with admiration and envy, now looked at her with something else entirely. It was a cold quiet and utterly merciless contempt. I, a historian, have spent my life studying the turning of tides, the fall of empires, the moments when a crowd's adoration curdles into its opposite. And I was now a witness to just such a moment. Her joke, her cruel, winking little story had been recontextualized by the truth. It was no longer a tasteless but perhaps forgivable social gaffe. It was now revealed for what it was, an act of monstrous, almost unimaginable cruelty. It was the act of a woman who had taken a family's sacred secret tragedy, a story of mental illness and suicide, and a father's heartbreaking sacrifice, and had turned it into a cheap, light-hearted punchline to make herself seem clever and charming. I saw it in their faces. The older women in the room, mothers and grandmothers themselves, looked at her with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The powerful, successful men who valued loyalty and strength above all else looked at her as if she were a treacherous and untrustworthy subordinate. She had not just been cruel to an old man. She had desecrated the memory of a dead woman. She had mocked the very idea of a father's love. And in that room, in that moment, she had committed a social suicide from which there was no coming back. Her entire kingdom, the kingdom of perception and image and charm that she had so carefully constructed, had vanished in the space of a 10-minute speech. Her power, which was derived entirely from the admiration of others, was gone, and she knew it. I watched her face the face of a brilliant strategist who has just realized she has been outmaneuvered and checkmated in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Her mind, which I knew was a sharp and calculating thing, was racing, trying to find a new script, a new angle, a new performance that could salvage this disaster. But there was none. The truth was too big. The crime was too ugly. She took a hesitant step towards the microphone as if to speak, to explain, to somehow spin this into a misunderstanding. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. What could she say? I'm sorry, I didn't know the woman I was mocking had died a tragic death. I'm sorry, I didn't realize the man I just called a pathetic victim was actually a quiet hero. Any words she could have spoken would have only dug her grave deeper. The brilliant, articulate, and always in control Chloe Bennet was for the first time in her life rendered utterly and completely speechless. Her eyes wide with a frantic animal panic darted to her own parents in the front row, a last desperate plea for an ally. But her father was staring down at his plate, his face a mask of profound and public shame. And her mother, a woman as hard and as polished as Chloe herself, just looked back at her with a cold, unforgiving stare that said, "You did this. This is your mess. Don't you dare drag us down with you." She was completely and utterly alone. It was my son who finally broke the terrible silent stand. He had been standing beside me, his arm a solid protective weight on my shoulders. Now he gently let go, and he turned to face his wife. The man who had looked at her with such blind adoration just a short time ago was gone. The man who faced her now was a stranger, his eyes as cold and as clear as a winter sky. He was a judge just like his father, and he was about to deliver his sentence. "I think," he began, his voice quiet, calm, and utterly final, "that you and I are done here, Chloe." She let out a small choked gasp, shaking her head in a gesture of pure instinctual denial. But he was not finished. He was not going to yell. He was not going to argue. "You stood on this stage," he said, his voice a low, cutting whisper that the microphone carried to every corner of the room. "And you took the most sacred, painful, and private part of my family's history, a truth my father protected for 32 years to save my heart, and you used it as a punchline. You used it to get a cheap laugh from a room full of strangers." He took a step towards her, his movement a slow, deliberate advance. "You didn't just disrespect my father," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, thick with a contempt that was a terrible thing to witness. "You desecrated the memory of my mother, a woman you never knew, a woman whose name you are not worthy to speak. The woman I thought I was marrying tonight, the woman who was kind and compassionate and loving, she doesn't exist. She was just a performance, another one of your perfect, well-rehearsed stories. And the show," he said, his voice a final, flat line, "is over." He then did a thing of such quiet, devastating finality that it was more powerful than any shout could have ever been. He calmly and with a steady hand reached down and slipped the new gold wedding band from his finger. He did not look at it. He did not throw it. He simply walked over to the lectern and he placed it gently on the polished wood next to her untouched glass of champagne. The small metallic sound of the ring touching the wood was the sound of a door slamming shut forever. "My lawyer," he said without looking at her, "will be in touch with yours." He then turned his back on her. He walked over to me, to his old broken father, and he put his arm around my shoulders once more. "Let's go home, Dad," he said softly. And together, a father and a son, two survivors of a war they had not known they were fighting, we walked off that stage. We walked through the silent parting sea of guests who looked at us now not with pity, but with a quiet, profound, and deeply human respect. We did not look back. We walked out of the ballroom, out of that grand hotel, out of the wreckage of my son's marriage, and we walked out into the cool, clean, and honest air of the night. Behind us, I knew Chloe was left standing alone on that brightly lit stage, a perfect silver statue in the middle of her own beautiful, expensive, and now utterly empty ruins. She had wanted a perfect day. She had wanted a perfect story. And in the end, she had gotten one. It was a perfect and total and irreversible disaster. And she was the only one left to applaud. The moment my son wrapped his arms around me on that stage was the moment the war ended. The truth, after 32 years of silence, had finally been spoken, and its power was absolute. It had not just... The hero and the villain had switched places. The object of pity had become the object of respect, and the radiant worshipped bride had become a pariah. We stood there for a long moment, a father and a son clinging to each other in the wreckage, and the room remained in that profound, respectful silence. And in that silence, every eye in that grand hall, every last one of them turned to Chloe. She was still standing on the stage a few feet away from us, a perfect silver statue of a woman. But the spotlight which had so recently been her adoring servant was now a harsh, interrogating glare. The audience that had been captivated by her charm was now a silent, unified jury, and their verdict was written on every single face. It was a verdict of pure, unadulterated contempt. I watched her not with anger anymore, but with a kind of clinical, historical curiosity. I was watching the fall of her entire life, her entire sense of self was built on a foundation of control, of managing perceptions, of writing the narrative. And in the space of a single speech, she had lost control of everything. The narrative was no longer hers to write. Her mind, which I knew to be a sharp and calculating thing, must have been racing, desperately searching for a new script, a new angle, a new performance that could salvage this catastrophe. But there was none. The truth was too big. Her crime against decency, against the memory of my wife, was too profound. For the first time in her life, she had no lines. She took a hesitant step towards the microphone, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her mouth opened a small, dark O of desperation, but no words came out. What could she say? The brilliant, articulate, and always in command Chloe Bennett was rendered utterly and completely speechless. Her greatest weapon, her sharp silver tongue, was useless against a truth this powerful. Her eyes, wide with a frantic animal panic, darted to the front table to her own parents. It was a last, desperate plea for an ally, a lifeline. Her father, a man as hard and as polished as she was, had been sitting with a look of thunderous fury on his face. But the fury was not for me. It was for the public embarrassing failure of his own daughter. He met her gaze across the silent room, his expression one of cold, hard disappointment. He then looked at his wife, and a silent, almost imperceptible communication passed between them. It was a look that said, "This is unsalvageable. We are leaving." Her father stood up. He did not make a scene. He simply, with a quiet, grim finality, pushed his chair back. Her mother stood up with him. They did not look at their daughter on the stage. They did not look at anyone. They just turned to... They were abandoning their own child on the battlefield, severing their connection to her failure with a ruthlessness that was, I now understood, a family trait. That was the moment that finally and truly broke her. The sight of her own family turning their backs on her, leaving her alone in the wreckage, was a blow from which she could not recover. A low, guttural sound, a sound of pure, abject despair, tore itself from her throat. She stumbled backwards, away from the microphone, away from the silent, judging eyes of the crowd. She did not look at my son. She did not look at me. She just turned, her movements clumsy in the magnificent dress that was now a costume from a tragedy, and she fled. She half ran, half stumbled down the small stairs at the back of the stage and made for a side exit, a door that led to the service hallways. Her walk of shame. The crowd parted for her, a silent, disgusted sea, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. And then she was gone, a silver ghost vanishing into the darkness. Her departure broke the spell. The tense, silent standoff was over. The exodus began. It was not the frantic, panicked flight of the previous story. It was a quiet, somber, and respectful departure. The guests stood up from their tables, their movements slow as if they were leaving a funeral. As they filed past the stage, many of them men and women I did not know, met my eyes. And they did not look at me with pity. They nodded. A small, silent gesture of respect, of understanding, of shared humanity. They were acknowledging my pain and my sacrifice. Marcus and I stood on that stage and watched as the room emptied out, the beautiful, expensive party dissolving into a collection of abandoned tables and wilting flowers. The wedding was over. The engagement was broken. My son's heart was shattered. My daughter-in-law's life was in ruins. Justice had been served, and it was a brutal, ugly, and devastating thing. I looked at my son, his face a mask of grief, and I put my arm around his shoulders. The war was over, and we, the survivors, were left to stand in the quiet, desolate ashes. The walk away from that grand hotel was a blur. My son Marcus held my arm, his grip firm and steady, a silent, physical support that I desperately needed. We did not speak. There were no words for what had just happened. We got into his car, a machine as sleek and as silent as the man he had once been, and he drove. He did not drive me back to my quiet, empty house. He drove to his own hotel, a different, quieter place where he had booked a room for himself for the night, a place he was supposed to return to with his new wife. The hotel room was like any other, impersonal, clean, and utterly devoid of character. It was a blank space, a stark contrast to the opulent, emotionally charged ballroom we had just left. Marcus closed the door behind us, and the silence that filled the room was not the tense, expectant silence of the wedding reception. It was a new silence, a silence of shared grief, of a world that had been shattered and had not yet begun to be rebuilt. He took off his tuxedo jacket and tossed it onto a chair, the gesture of a man shedding a costume. He loosened his tie. He walked over to the minibar, his movements stiff and weary, and he poured 2 glasses of water. He handed one to me. Our hands touched for a fraction of a second, and in that small contact a lifetime of unspoken truths seemed to pass between us. We sat in 2 armchairs by the window looking out at the glittering, indifferent lights of the city. For a long time we just sat there, 2 men in a quiet room drinking water. It was Marcus who spoke first. His voice, when it came, was a raw, broken thing, the voice of the 10-year-old boy I had tried so hard to protect, coming from the mouth of a "Why?" he whispered, not looking at me but at the reflection of the room in the dark glass of the window. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" I took a deep, shaky breath. This was the conversation I had been dreading and rehearsing in the quiet of my own mind for 32 years. "Because you were 10 years old, son," I said softly. "Because you were a child who adored his mother with a purity and a completeness that was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. How could I tell that little boy that his mother's own mind had turned against her? How could I explain a sickness that even the doctors, the experts, could barely understand?" I turned to look at him. His face was a mask of pain. "To tell you she had taken her own life, it would have been to place a burden on your heart that I did not think you could carry. A child's mind. It doesn't understand depression. It doesn't understand mental illness. It only understands love." And a child in his heart would have translated that terrible, complicated truth into one simple and soul-crushing question. Was I not enough to make her want to live? He flinched a small, involuntary movement, and I knew that I had spoken the very fear that had haunted my own nightmares for all those years. "I could not do that to you," I continued, my voice a raw whisper. "I could not let you carry that. It was not your burden to carry. It was mine, so I took it. I took the truth and I buried it, and in its place I gave you a simpler story, a cleaner wound, the story of a woman who left. It was a terrible lie, son, but it was a lie born of a love so fierce it was a form of madness. I chose to let the world think I was a man who had been abandoned, a man to be pitied so that you could grow up with the pure, uncomplicated memory of a mother who loved you, a mother who would never, ever have left you by choice." He finally turned to look at me. His eyes, the brilliant, intelligent eyes of a surgeon, were now just the lost, wounded eyes of a son. "So you carried it," he said the words, a statement of dawning, horrified awe. "All this time, all the whispers, all the pitying looks from the other parents at school. You just took it. Alone." I was not alone. I said, my own voice breaking for the first time. "I had you." We were silent again for a long time. The weight of those 32 years of silence was a physical presence in the room. He was grieving not just for the mother he had lost, but for the father he had never truly known, the man who had been hiding his own profound, lifelong wound behind a mask of quiet, dependable strength. "I am so sorry, Dad," he finally whispered, his voice thick with a new and terrible and beautiful understanding. "I'm so sorry for tonight, for what she did, for what I allowed her to do. I never saw. I never—" "You were not meant to see," I said. "That was the whole point of the sacrifice. You were meant to live your life, to be happy, to build something beautiful. You were not meant to be a guardian of a grave." He stood up and began to pace the small room, a caged animal of grief and rage. "But she, Chloe, to take that, your sacrifice, and to turn it into a joke, to stand on that stage and wink, it was monstrous. She did not know the truth, son." I said, a weak, pathetic defense that I didn't even believe myself. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes flashing with a new cold fire. "That's the point, Dad," he said, his voice a low growl. "She didn't know. And she didn't care. She saw a vulnerability, a point of pain, and she used it for a cheap laugh to make herself look clever. It doesn't matter what the truth was. Her character, the real nature of her, was in that act. We talked for hours that night for the first time in our lives, not as a father and a son playing their familiar roles, but as 2 men bound by a shared love for a woman who was a beautiful, tragic ghost. He asked questions about her music, about her laughter, about the darkness, and I answered them one by one. The truth, a painful but cleansing river. We were not just talking about the past. We were rebuilding it. We were taking the fictional story I had created and replacing it with the real, messy, painful, and beautiful truth. As the first faint light of dawn began to creep into the hotel room, a new and fragile and honest foundation had been laid between us. The lie was dead. The secret was gone. And all that was left in that quiet, sterile room was the truth of a mother's tragic death, the truth of a father's terrible sacrifice, and the truth of a son's love, a love that had proven in the end to be strong enough to hear it all. The aftermath of the wedding was not a clean break. It was a slow, messy, and painful unraveling. The story as I knew it would become the stuff of legend in the social circles Chloe had so desperately wanted to conquer. But for us, for Marcus and me, it was not a story. It was just a quiet, empty space where a family used to be. We talked that first night in the sterile quiet of the hotel room, and for the first time in his life, my son saw the full, complicated, and tragic picture of his mother. He had spent his life grieving for a woman who had abandoned him. Now he had to begin the much harder work of grieving for the woman who had been taken from him, and for the 32 years of truth he had been denied. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal necessities for him, annulment papers, lawyers, the quiet, brutal work of dismantling a life that had barely begun. For me, the secret I had carried for so long was gone, and its absence was a weight of its own. I felt lighter, but also untethered a ship that had finally dropped an anchor it had been dragging for half a lifetime. It was almost a month later when he came to my house. He didn't call first. He just appeared at my door on a Saturday afternoon looking tired and thin, but with a new, quiet stillness in his eyes. We didn't talk about Chloe. We didn't talk about the wedding. He just looked at me and asked, "Her piano, is it still in the attic?" I just nodded. I led him up the creaky pull-down stairs into the dusty, sunlit attic, a place he had not been since he was a boy. And there it was in the far corner, under a heavy canvas drop-cloth, the shape of it like a sleeping giant. The old upright piano my Althea had played an instrument that had been silent for 32 years. We pulled the cloth off together. The wood was dull, the keys yellowed. Marcus sat down on the old wobbly bench. He tentatively reached out and pressed a single key. A low, out-of-tune but beautiful note echoed in the quiet, dusty air. It was the first note of her music to be heard in that house in over 3 decades. "I don't remember the sound," he whispered, his voice full of a strange wonder. "I remember that she played, but I can't actually hear it in my head." It was a confession of a theft more profound than any money could represent. The lie I had told, the silence I had kept it, had not just protected him from the truth of her death. It had robbed him of the truth of her life, her music. Without a word, I went downstairs. I went to the back of my own closet, to a place I had not disturbed for many years, and I pulled out an old, forgotten wooden chest. It was not locked. Her memory had never been a prison. It was just a place too painful to visit. I carried it upstairs to the attic. I knelt on the dusty floorboards and opened it, the air filled with the faint papery scent of old sheet music and time. I couldn't get rid of it. I said, my voice a rough, quiet thing. I couldn't. The chest was her archive. It was filled with her life's work. Stacks of sheet music, the pages covered in her elegant, frantic handwriting full of notes and corrections, old concert programs with her name on them, and at the very bottom, a small, unassuming collection of cassette tapes. "What are these, Marcus asked, picking one up. His surgeon's fingers turning the small plastic object over and over. She was always practicing. I explained the memories coming back in a flood. She had a small tape recorder she kept on the piano. She would record herself to listen back, to find the flaws, to perfect a phrase. They're not professional, they're just her. In a room, I had a small, dusty cassette player in a box of old electronics in the corner. It took us 10 minutes to find it to get the batteries in to make it work. He slid the first tape in. He pressed the play button. There was a hiss of static, the sound of a room's silence. And then it began. It was a Chopin nocturne, a piece I had heard her play 1,000 times. The sound was a little warped, a little tinny, the sound of a ghost. But it was her touch, her phrasing, her soul translated into music. We sat there on the dusty floor of that attic, a father and a son, and we listened. We listened as the ghost of my wife of his mother filled the silent house with her music for the first time in 32 years. He closed his eyes and the tears streamed down his face, not tears of pain this time, but tears of discovery. He was not just hearing a piece of music, he was meeting his mother for the very first time. And I was not just hearing an old recording. I was hearing the woman I loved. Her voice finally blessedly return to the quiet, empty rooms of my heart. We sat there for hours listening to the beautiful, tragic, and immortal music of Althea. And in that shared sacred silence, the real healing, the first true note of our new life, finally began. The attic became a kind of sanctuary for us in the weeks that followed. That first day we had sat on the dusty floor for hours listening to the ghostly, beautiful music of my Althea pour from the small speakers of the old cassette player. It was a baptism in the truth, a shared sacred grief that was as painful as it was necessary. For my son, he was not just hearing his mother's music, he was meeting her for the very first time. He was discovering the brilliant, passionate, and tormented soul behind the simple, flat story I had given him. He was trading the ghost of a woman who had left for the real, complex, and beautiful woman who had been. He came back the next weekend and the weekend after that. He brought with him a high-tech digital converter he had bought online, and together we began a new project. A quiet, meticulous, and deeply loving work of historical preservation. We took each of those old, fragile cassette tapes and one by one we converted them into clean, crisp digital files. It was slow work. The old tapes would sometimes snag and the sound was often warped with age. But with every piece of music we saved from the silence of the past, I felt like we were saving a piece of her. And we talked. For the first time in our lives, we truly talked. As the music played, he would ask questions. Quiet, gentle questions. What was she like when she played this piece? Was this during one of her good times? Did I ever hear her play this? And I would answer my own memories, which I had kept locked away for so long, now unlocked by the sound of her music. I told him stories. I told him about the time she had played at a small club in the city and a famous jazz musician in the audience had stood up and applauded. I told him about how she would compose in the middle of the night, a frantic, brilliant energy pouring out of her, the music, a living thing that she was wrestling onto the page. And I told him about the darkness. I told him about the quiet days, about the silence, about the look of profound and distant sorrow in her eyes. I told him about the struggle, about her courage, about the war she had fought inside her own beautiful, brilliant mind. I did not hide the truth from him anymore. He was no longer a 10-year-old boy to be protected. He was a man, and he deserved the whole story with all its light and all its shadows. As we worked, I saw a change in him. The initial raw grief began to transform into something else. It became a deep and profound and fierce pride. He was not just the son of a woman who had been a victim of her own illness. He was the son of a brilliant artist, a woman of incredible strength and passion. He began to see her not as an absence, but as a presence, a legacy. About 2 months after the wedding, he came over on a Sunday, but he didn't head for the attic. He sat me down at the kitchen table, a seriousness in his eyes I had not seen since that terrible night. He placed a thick, professionally printed brochure in front of me. The title on the front read, "The Althea Ramsey Foundation for Music and Mind." I stared at it, my heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. I opened it. Inside it detailed the mission of a new charitable foundation. It was a scholarship, a fund designed to support gifted young musicians who were also struggling with the challenges of mental health. It would provide not just financial aid for their musical education, but also access to therapy, to counseling, to the kind of support my Althea had so desperately needed. And at the bottom of the page, there was a picture of her, a beautiful smiling picture from one of her old concert programs, her face full of a light and a life that I had not allowed myself to truly look at in 32 years. And beneath it, a simple dedication, in memory of a brilliant pianist and a beloved mother whose music was a light that fought and will continue to fight against the darkness. I looked up at my son, the words blurring through the tears in my eyes. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice thick with an emotion I could not name. "I had to do something, Dad," he said, his own voice unsteady. "Her story, her struggle, it can't just be a private tragedy. It has to mean something. It has to help someone. She was not just a victim, she was a fighter, and her fight should be an inspiration, not a secret." He had taken the ugly, painful truth of her life, a truth that had been hidden in the shadows for so long, and he was not just bringing it into the light. He was turning it into a light, a beacon for others who were lost in the same darkness she had been. It was without a doubt the single greatest act of love, of honor, and of respect I had ever witnessed. He was not just memorializing his mother, he was resurrecting her, transforming her private pain into a public good. He was taking the broken pieces of our family's past and he was building something new and beautiful and strong. I reached across the table and I took his hand, the hand of a surgeon, the hand of my son, and I held it. The shame was gone. The lies were gone. The silence was gone. And in their place was a new and powerful and unbreakable truth. My wife, my Althea, was not a sad, forgotten ghost. She was a legacy. And my son, my beautiful, brilliant son, had finally and truly come home to her. The quiet, steady work of healing is a slow and unglamorous thing. It does not happen in a single dramatic moment of forgiveness. It happens in the small, quiet spaces in between. It happened for my son and me in the shared, comfortable silence of my workshop, in the easy rhythm of our weekly phone calls, in the shared grief and discovery of listening to his mother's old cassette tapes. The old relationship, the one built on a foundation of a protective lie, had been demolished. And in its place we were slowly, carefully building something new, something stronger, something built on the bedrock of truth. About a year after the wedding, Marcus called me. The first Althea Ramsey Foundation scholar is giving her debut recital tonight, he said, his voice full of a quiet pride. At the Curtis Institute. I have 2 tickets. I was hoping you'd come with me. And so, on a cool autumn evening, I found myself sitting not in a grand, opulent ballroom, but in a small, acoustically perfect concert hall, a place built not for the performance of status, but for the sacred act of making music. The air was not thick with the scent of money. It was filled with a quiet, respectful anticipation. We were not at the front, not in a special box. We were just 2 men sitting in the middle of a crowd of people who had come to listen. A woman, the dean of the conservatory, walked onto the stage. She spoke briefly about the new foundation, about its dual mission to support both artistic talent and mental well-being. She spoke of my Althea not as a tragic figure, but as a brilliant artist, whose legacy was now being transformed into a source of hope and support for a new generation. And then she introduced the first recipient of the scholarship. A young woman no older than 20 walked out onto the stage. She was a pianist. She sat down at the grand piano, her back straight, her hands hovering. This first piece, she said, her voice a soft, nervous thing that was nonetheless full of a profound gratitude, is an original composition by the woman whose generosity made this all possible. This is for Althea Ramsey. And then she began to play. The music that filled the hall was not the tinny, warped sound of an old cassette tape. It was alive. It was a rich, complex, and breathtakingly beautiful melody, full of a soaring joy and a deep, heartbreaking sorrow. It was my wife's music, her very soul, resurrected from the silence and brought to vibrant, glorious life by the hands of this gifted young woman. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 32 years, I did not just remember my wife. I felt her. She was not a ghost in the passenger seat. She was not a sad, secret memory. She was here in the music, filling every corner of the room, as real and as present as the son who was sitting beside me. He was not looking at the stage. He was looking at me, a small, sad, and beautiful smile on his face. And in that moment I saw the full measure of the man he had become. The old desperate need for approval, the ambition that had been a hungry, hollow thing, it was all gone. In its place was a quiet, steady strength, a deep and compassionate understanding that had been bought at a terrible price. He had spent the last year not just grieving for the mother he had lost, but getting to know her through her music, through my stories. And in doing so, he had finally truly found himself. The relationship we had now was nothing like the one we'd had before. The old roles were gone. I was no longer his silent protector, and he was no longer the boy I needed to shield from the world. We were 2 men, a father and a son, who had walked through a great and terrible fire together and had come out on the other side scarred but whole. Our new bond was not forged in a lie, no matter how loving. It was forged in the truth, no matter how painful. It was quieter, it was more somber, but it was infinitely stronger. The young woman on the stage finished the piece, the final beautiful note hanging in the air for a long, perfect moment before the hall erupted in a thunderous standing ovation. We stood and applauded with the rest of them, not just for the young artist, but for my Althea, for her music, for her fight, for her legacy. Marcus leaned over, his voice a low whisper in my ear, barely audible above the applause. "She would have loved this," he said. I was too full of an emotion I could not name to speak. I just nodded, and I put my hand on my son's shoulder, my grip firm and full of a love that no longer needed lies to sustain it. We walked out of the concert hall together, side by side, into the cool, clear night. We did not speak of the past. We did not need to. The music had said it all. I had lost the son I had spent a lifetime protecting. But in his place, I had gained a man I could stand beside as an equal, a man who was no longer haunted by a lie, but was now illuminated by the truth. The house was quiet when I got home. But it was not an empty quiet. It was a peaceful quiet. The war was over. The music had returned. And my heart, after all these years, was finally and truly at peace. The concert for the first Althea Ramsey Scholar was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the first public note in a new kind of music for our family, a melody built not on a secret sorrow, but on a shared and honest truth. In the year that has followed, that music has only grown richer, more profound. The seasons have turned. The world has kept moving. My son Marcus and his wife Chloe are no longer a part of the same story. She, I am told, moved away from Philadelphia, seeking a new stage, a new audience for her performances, a new life to build. I do not know where she is, and I do not wish her ill. I simply wish her a peace. I doubt she will ever find a peace that cannot be bought or curated, but can only be earned through honesty. Marcus is still here. He is still a brilliant surgeon, a man who saves lives with his steady, gifted hands. But he is a different man. The frantic, desperate need for success, the ambition that was a hungry ghost at his back, is gone. In its place is a quiet, steady purpose. He is a man who is no longer running from his past, but is actively engaged in building a future on top of it. The Althea Ramsey Foundation has flourished, a testament to his devotion, a beautiful living monument to the mother he is only now getting to know. Our relationship, his and mine, is the strangest and most beautiful thing to have grown from the ashes of that terrible wedding. We are historians, the two sole members of a society dedicated to the memory of Althea Ramsey. We have spent countless hours in my attic digitizing her old sheet music, listening to the ghostly recordings of her playing and talking. We talk about everything, about her music, about her light, about her darkness. He asks the questions of a son who is finally getting to meet his mother, and I answer with the honesty of a father who no longer has any secrets left to keep. Tonight, I am alone in my house. It is a quiet, rainy evening. The world outside is a soft gray blur. I am not in the attic. I am not in my workshop. I am in my living room, sitting in my old, comfortable armchair, and I am listening to her. The music, once a tinny, warped sound. The sound is so clear, so present. It is as if she is in the room with me, her hands on the keys of the old piano that now sits in my living room, a gift from my son. He had it moved from the attic, painstakingly restored and tuned. "She belongs downstairs," he had said, "where we can hear her." I close my eyes and I listen to her play. It is a complex, heartbreakingly beautiful piece, one of her own compositions. A piece full of a soaring joy and a deep, underlying sorrow. It is the sound of her soul. The pain of her loss, I have learned, will never go away. It is a part of me, a room in the house of my heart that will always be hers. For 32 years, I kept that door locked, terrified of the grief that lived inside. But now the door is open. The pain is still there. The ache of her absence is as real as the chair I am sitting in. But it is no longer a lonely, shameful, secret pain. It is a shared pain. It is a pain that is now wrapped in the warmth of my son's love, in the beauty of his understanding, and the honor he has paid to her memory. The pain is still a part of me, but it no longer defines me. It is just one note in a much larger and much more beautiful symphony. I am not a happy man, not in the simple, uncomplicated way I once thought happiness was supposed to be. I am a man who has known a profound and lasting sorrow. I am a man who was forced to make a terrible, impossible choice. I did a hard thing, a brutal thing. I stood by and watched as my son's world was shattered, a world I had helped to build. But it was a world built on a lie. And a house built on a lie cannot stand. I do not regret what I did. I only regret that it was necessary. The final beautiful note of the piano piece hangs in the air, a perfect shimmering thing before it fades into a gentle, peaceful silence. The house is quiet again. The rain patters softly against the window pane. I open my eyes. I look at the pictures of my Althea on the mantel, her face so full of a life that was both a tragedy and a triumph. I look at the picture of my son beside her, his own face now full of a quiet, hard-won wisdom. The war is over. The secrets are gone. The lie is dead. And I, Elias Ramsey, a 75-year-old retired history professor, a husband, a father, I am at peace. A quiet and a total and a final peace. For over 30 years I built a wall of lies around my son to protect him from a painful truth, believing it was a father's greatest sacrifice. But at his wedding, I learned that the heaviest burdens are the secrets we carry for others. My son's fiancée mocked the lie, but my son in his strength honored the truth. He taught me that true fatherhood isn't about shielding your children from the storms of the past, but about having the courage to stand with them in the rain. Love is not... Do you think I made the right choice all those years ago? I would be honored to read your perspective in the comments below. And if you believe that truth, no matter how painful, is the only real foundation for a family, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories.